You can think of Tolkien's poetry as a synthesis of various styles across centuries and cultures, and that's represented in the diversity of cultures in Middle-earth. Among the elf songs, there's a touch of the medieval Latin Marian hymns, there's a loftiness of Middle English rhythms, and there's also several crystal images inspired, I think, by the Anglo-Saxon poems. His Hobbit songs, in those, there's something more of the homegrown English ballad or the nursery rhyme, sometimes blended with a more mature style, in the case of Bilbo's songs, with the adventuresome picaresque. And in the songs of the Rohirrim, you can catch glimpses of the stony austerity of the Anglo-Saxon lyric. Among other human being poetry, the poetry of men, the Gondorians have a very lofty style. There's a grandeur there that's comparable to, I think, some of the Roman histories and some of the mythic qualities found in Irish mythologies, especially in the themes of heroism, loss, time, beauty in nature, and all of this is often veiled in a melancholy of fading worlds or worlds remembered, and this immortal sorrow. So all of that's going on and in his poetry, and it all has roots to the actual canon of English poetry and beyond the English canon. But all of the poetry of Tolkien, all the poetry of Middle-earth, contains a touch of the Romantic and Victorian poetry of England. So for those of you whose interest in poetry has been awakened by Tolkien, I'm going to give you 5 recommendations for further reading. Before we get started, I have to say that I'm going mostly off of feeling here, or vibes, which is a recent term that means a sort of ineffable aesthetic quality that's easily intuited or recognized, but not easily described. And it's something like an atmosphere that contains an emotional or artistic resonance or association. So I'm not making the claim that Tolkien was necessarily influenced by these poets. I think some of these poets he actually would not like to be grouped with, but the connection is real, and I'll tell you which ones those are. And I'm going to rank them from least to greatest, beginning with Gerard Manley Hopkins. Tolkien and Hopkins share a theological aesthetic. There's certainly a luminosity in Hopkins's poetry and a sense of the numinous which accords with Tolkien's own theological principles. And there's the fact that both Tolkien and Hopkins were both inspired by Anglo-Saxon poetry, although each applied Anglo-Saxon principles to their poetry to different effects. Hopkins pioneered the sprung rhythm, a meter that mimics the natural speech while maintaining musicality. It's also very inspired by the rough textures of Anglo-Saxon verse. Tolkien, too, crafted intricate metrical schemes, often echoing the alliterative verse of the Anglo-Saxons. Both poets use rhythm as a vessel for emotional intensity and for metaphysical meaning. Let me read you just this one sonnet by Hopkins. I have a collection here of his poems, which you can find. I think there's one by Penguin, which is really good as well, and also comes with some notes from his journals. But this is from The Starlight Night. And I'm just going to read the first 8 lines, the octet. Look at the stars. Look up at the skies. Oh, look at all the fire folk sitting in the air, the bright boroughs, the circled citadels there. Down in dim woods the diamond delves, the elves' eyes, the grey lawns cold where quick gold lies, the wind-beat white beam, airy ably set on flare, flake dove scent floating forth at a farmyard scare. Ah, well, it is all a purchase, all a prize. Think of those lines. You probably heard it there. The dim woods, the diamond delves, the gray lawns, cold. So you get a sense of how some of the imagery here and also the shared inspiration actually makes Gerard Manley Hopkins a great poet to turn to if you like Tolkien's poetry. Now, number 5 is William Butler Yeats, the Irish poet of mystical vision and Ireland. He drew from folklore and Irish mythology to make a verse that was prophetic and personal. He shares some similarities with Tolkien in the sense that, like Tolkien, he turned to ancient narratives to voice modern anxieties and to surface some answers to spiritual questions. When I was trying to put together this list, I mentioned Yeats to my wife, and we were kind of at odds about this one because in some sense, Yeats's archetypes and his occult imagery isn't quite Tolkienian. So I'll qualify this recommendation to early Yeats. Yeats's earlier poetry was much more in accordance, I think, with Tolkien's whole aesthetic in Lord of the Rings. But just listen to this gorgeous example from William Butler Yeats, and I have this collection here. This, in fact, is the collection we are going to be using in mid-June when I host a course on the poetry of Yeats. We're going to be reading all of his poetry, actually. It's the first time we've ever done that. So this is from one of the early periods. This poem is called The Dedication to a Book of Stories Selected from the Irish Novelists. And those of you who enjoy Tolkien's imagery, I think, will find something here worth enjoying. There was a green branch hung with many a bell when our own people ruled this tragic ire, and from its murmuring greenness calm a fairy, a druid kindness on all hearers fell. It charmed away the merchant from his guile, and turned the farmer's memory from his cattle, and hushed in sleep the roaring ranks of battle, and all grew friendly for a little while. Ah, exiles, wandering over lands and seas, and plotting always that some morrow may set a stone upon ancestral sorrow, I also bear a bell branch full of ease. I tore it from the green boughs winds tore and tossed, until the sap of summer had grown weary. I tore it from the barren bough of Ire, that country where a man can be so crossed, can be so battered, badgered, and destroyed that he's a loveless man. Gay bells bring laughter that shakes a mouldering cobweb from the rafter, and yet the saddest chimes are best enjoyed. Gay bells or sad, they bring you memories of half-forgotten, innocent old places. We, in our bitterness, have left no traces on Munster grass and Connemara skies. You think that last stanza, gay bells or sad, they bring you memories of half-forgotten, innocent old places. Isn't that just the aesthetic of Tolkien's poems sometimes? So much of it is much elegy of remembrance. And also notice that in Tolkien's Hymn to Elbereth, he has that line, "O light to us that wander here amid the world of woven trees," which always makes me think of Yeats's The Deep Woods Woven Shade. He has that word woven appearing in many of his early poetry when describing the woods. So both Yeats and Tolkien revered the mythic past, but Tolkien's verse tends toward elegy and plays with linguistic reconstruction in a way that Yeats, I think, is more interested in his early poetry in pursuing revelation through a symbolic recurrence of these old mythic images. And if you want to read more of Yeats, you should join my online school for poetry starting in July, where we're going to be reading all of Yeats's poetry from early to late. Now we need to move on to number 4, which Tolkien would probably hate me for adding this to the video, but it's Algernon Swinburne. And there's probably too much luxurious excess in Swinburne to argue for a real connection between the two poets. But it does seem to me that what people like about Tolkien's poetry is the music and the atmosphere, this sense of being drawn into a secluded and very real world. And there's an example of this in some of Swinburne's lyric poetry. Let me read you from Swinburne. Don't have a collection of Swinburne, but I do have this very good Victorian poetry and poetics anthology that I sometimes teach from. This is from the Garden of Proserpine, or rather Proserpine, as Swinburne pronounces it. No growth of moor or coppice, no heather flower or vine, but bloomless buds of poppies, green grapes of Proserpine. Pale beds of blowing rushes, where no leaf blooms or blushes, save this whereout she crushes for dead men deadly wine. Pale without name or number, and fruitless fields of corn, they bow themselves and slumber all night till light is born, and like a soul belated In hell and heaven unmated, by clouds and mist debated, comes out the darkness morn. And then here at the end, then star nor sun shall waken, nor any change of light, nor sound of waters shaken, nor any sound or sight, nor wintry leaves nor vernal, nor days nor things diurnal, only the sleep eternal in an eternal night. So here you can get a sense of the musicality that I think is really rich in Swinburne and in Tolkien as well. He has these kind of hypnotic rhythms, and his diction, Swinburne's diction, is too ornate for Tolkien, who preferred the more heroic chastity of the Anglo-Saxons to the delicate excess that we have here in Swinburne. But there's such music here that if it's music you're after, you would probably love Swinburne. Now the third poet is Alfred Lord Tennyson. And there are two avenues, two paths to pursue here that you could take. One is that of epic. You know, I think those of you who are really interested in epic poetry and the epic dimensions of Tolkien's work probably really enjoy The Idylls of the King. It's Tennyson's retelling of the Arthurian myth of, King Arthur, and it centralizes around him, but also his knights. It's a Victorian reconstruction. It's all about this. It's part of this movement in the late 19th century when people were really interested in reviving the medieval past. And this legacy, this tradition was really important to Tolkien's imagination. You really can't understand Tolkien's whole literary output in the context of literature without understanding Victorian medievalism. So this book contains some heroic grandeur, some simplicity, really kind of what you would call a masculine style, probably very similar to the language of the Rohirrim in the chapters in Lord of the Rings where you're in Rohan. But if you go to lyric poetry in Tennyson, you won't find a better Victorian poet. Let me just read you a stanza from his lyric poem, The Lady of Shalott, which also just has that sense of musicality which Tolkien had an ear for and that I think you'll enjoy. This is from the first stanza. In fact, I'll just read the whole stanza one. On either side the river lie long fields of barley and of rye, that clothe the wold and meet the sky, and through the field the road runs by to many-towered Camelot. And up and down the people go, gazing where the lilies blow round an island there below, the island of Shalott. It's a very beautiful poem. It's a story. It's a ballad. It's all within that Arthurian mythos. So if you love the more older stories from Tolkien's Legendarium, some of the poems from the Lays of Beleriand, I think you would enjoy many of Tennyson's lyric. Such beauty and such depth of imagery in that poem alone. And there's, I'm sure you noticed, the rhythm that enchants, like many of Tolkien's poems. Number 2 is one of my favorite poets, Christina Rossetti, a poet of devotional intensity and lyrical restraints. And I think formally she's very much like Tolkien, and Tolkien, I'm sure, read Rossetti. Her verse is full of spiritual yearning, fairy imagery, and a soft melancholy. Here's her song, Twilight Night, and tell me if you don't hear Barian and Luthien in these lines. And this is I have the Penguin edition here, which is really big, actually. She was prolific. So here's from the first section of Twilight Night by Christina Rossetti. We met, hand to hand. We clasped hands, close and fast, as close as oak and ivy stand. But it is past. Come day, come night. Day comes at last. We loosed hand from hand. We parted face from face. Each went his way to his own land at his own pace. Each went to fill his separate place. If we should meet one day, if both should not forget, we shall clasp hands the accustomed way, as when we met so long ago, as I remember yet. So you have a sense of history, a sense of wistfulness. She draws upon a rich poetic tradition of Christian symbolism and poetic form, while Tolkien extends his spiritual vision through epic myth and invented languages. Rossetti distills her her poetry, her music into intimate meditative lyricism. And I think she's very, very similar to Tolkien's style because both poets honor the past. So if Swinburne's erotic luxuries of surplus put you off, you may find a companion in Rossetti's poetry instead. Now, finally, we'll move to what I think is the most important lyric poet of the Victorian era who influenced Tolkien, and one of Tolkien's favorites, and one you probably haven't heard of because he's not taught often. That's William Morris. I have a very small collection of his verse here, which is really great. He wrote so much verse, some epic poetry, some histories, and Tolkien just loved Morris. He's the Victorian craftsman. You might know him for his wallpaper, and he was a poet also and a visionary socialist. He revived medieval romance with an eye for both aesthetic richness and moral earnestness. So he's within that tradition of the pre-Raphaelites. He was adjacent to Tennyson, who was also very interested in the medieval past. But let me just read you a portion from The Earthly Paradise. It's September. "O come at last, to whom the spring tide's hope looked for through blossoms, what hast thou for me? Green grows the grass upon the dewy slope, beneath the gold-hung, grey-leaved apple tree, moveless, e'en as the autumn fain would be, that shades its sad eyes from the rising sun, and weeps at eve, because the day is done." And skipping down, "Look long, O longing eyes, and look in vain, strain idly, aching heart, and yet be wise, and hope no more for things to come again, that thou beheldest once with careless eyes. Like a new wakened man thou art, who tries to dream again the dream that made him glad when in his arms his loving love he had." It's also a sense of loss, a sense of nostalgia, of longing. It's very beautiful, very atmospheric in the way that Tolkien's poetry is. There's another small poem of Morris's that I'll read, and I'll just read you one stanza from it. I'll read you two. This is a story. It's a brief ballad. "There was a lady lived in a hall, large in the eyes, and slim and tall, and ever she sung from noon to noon, 2 red roses across the moon. There was a knight came riding by in early spring when the roads were dry, and he heard that lady sing at the noon, 2 red roses across the moon." And it's a beautiful poem. It's a story. If you want to hear what happens, you'll have to read the rest. Tolkien was deeply influenced by Morris. He read Morris often, pretty much read everything of Morris, adopted not only his archaic diction and his narrative styles, but also this whole ethos of subcreation, which Morris was a forerunner of. So, I hope I've given you enough to go on, and since I've already started a canon here, I hope you'll add to it. What other poets should Tolkien fans read? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.